All right, Algebra 2. We're going to go ahead and move on to Unit 3.5. We're going to look at two new methods of solving quadratic equations. The first method that we're going to look at today is using the square root method, and then the second is using completing the square. When we get to solving completing the square, we'll use the square root method to actually solve also. All right, so let's go ahead and look, again, our general equation for a quadratic, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Again, because it has an x squared term, there's going to be two solutions, just like in factoring, there's two solutions. All right, so the second method, again, is using the square root method. All right, so what we want to do is isolate the x squared term, and then we can square root both sides. And because we're square rooting both sides, we have to remember to use that plus or minus symbol. And then we'll go ahead and solve the equation. So real quick, if we were to look at the equation x squared equals 9, we can see that the solutions would be positive 3 and negative 3. And that's because if you square both of those numbers, 3 and negative 3, you get positive 9. All right, and so that's why there's two solutions to the equation x squared equals 9. All right, so let's go ahead and solve each of these equations. Again, we want to first isolate the x squared term. All right, so on number 1, we're going to add 25 over to both sides. So we get x squared equals 25. All right, so we've isolated the x squared term. Now we're going to go ahead and square root both sides. Now, because we're square rooting both sides, we have to remember to put the plus or minus in front of the square root. Now, the square root of x squared is just going to simplify to x. All right, equals, and then we put that plus or minus symbol, square root of 25. All right, now once you get to this step, you want to try to simplify your radicals. Well, square root of 25, it does simplify to 5. So we get x equals plus or minus 5. Now, you can use that symbol. Okay, that's totally fine, plus or minus. But what that means is x equals positive 5 and x equals negative 5. All right, so that's what that plus or minus symbol means. It's positive and negative 5. All right, so number 2, x squared plus 13 equals negative 3. Again, we want to isolate that x squared term. So we're going to subtract 13 over. Negative 3 minus 13 is negative 16. All right, so now we're going to square root both sides. Keep that negative underneath the radical with the 16. Okay, so the square root of x squared is x equals, we square rooted, so again we have to put that plus or minus so we don't lose a solution. Remember, there's always going to be two solutions. Square root of negative 16. Now we want to try to simplify. Again, with negatives under radicals, we're going to pull those out. So we have plus or minus I root 16. So we want that I to go in between the plus or minus and the radical. Square root of 16 is 4. So now we have plus or minus 4i. Okay, again, that's the same as positive 4i and negative 4i. All right, number 3, again, we're going to isolate that x squared term. So I'll add 12. So x squared equals 20. We'll square root both sides. To get x equals plus or minus square root of 20. All right, now we want to try to simplify our radicals. Radical 20, we can break down to 5 times 4, and then 2 times 2, so there's our pair. So we get plus or minus, okay, that 2 is going to come out, and then the 5 stays inside the radical. All right, so plus or minus 2, radical 5. All right, so again, we want that plus or minus to come first, not in between the 2 and the radical. All right, number 4, again, we've got to isolate the x squared term. So here we're going to subtract 1 first. So we get 3x squared equals negative 21. Then we'll divide by 3. We have x squared equals negative 7. Now we can square root both sides. So x equals plus or minus. Pull the negative out. Okay, and then root 7. And then root 7 doesn't simplify, So that's as far as you can go. Plus or minus I root 7. All right, number 5, x plus 1 squared equals 36. All right, so step 1 again says to isolate the x squared term. So it's in parentheses. X plus 1 quantity squared is isolated. We don't have anything in front being multiplied. There's nothing on the right side of the parentheses being added or subtracted. So this is considered isolated. So we can go ahead and just square root both sides. So when we square root this square, again, those just cancel each other out. And so now we're just left with x plus 1 on the left equals, again, don't forget to put plus or minus, okay, root 36. All right, now we can go ahead and finish solving for x. Okay, square root of 36 does simplify to 6. Now we can subtract the 1 over. All right, so I have x equals negative 1 plus or minus 6. Now, because there's no radical or I in this problem, we can actually simplify this down to 2 numbers and not just leave it as negative 1 plus or minus 6. So what this says is negative 1 plus 6, and then it also says negative 1 minus 6. And so we actually want to add and subtract these 2 numbers together. All right, so negative 1 plus 6 is positive 5, and then negative 1 minus 6 is negative 7. So here's our 2 solutions. So you're not leaving it with the plus or minus on this problem. You're going to actually add and subtract the 2 numbers together. All right, number 6. Here we want to isolate the x minus 5 squared term. So we're going to divide by 3 first. So I have x minus 5 squared equals 6. All right, now we can go ahead and square root both sides. So the left side again, the square and the square root cancel out. So we have x minus 5 equals plus or minus root 6. Now root 6 is not going to simplify because you can only break it down to 2 and 3. But we can add the 5 over. Okay. So x equals 5 plus or minus root 6. Now this one has a radical in it, and you can't add 5 and root 6 together or subtract. So that's as far as you can go. Okay, now this again is the same as 5 plus root 6 and 5 minus root 6. So those are our 2 solutions to this problem. But again, if you want to use the symbol, that's fine. All right, so that's how you do solving with square roots. So now we're going to look at this third method. So again, the first method was solving by factoring. Second method is solving using square roots. And so this third method is solving by completing the square. And so what we want to do is write a perfect square trinomial. So a trinomial, again, is 3 terms. And a perfect square trinomial comes into play in completing the square. So again, our equation ax squared plus bx plus c. And so what we're going to do is try to find the c value, and that's going to turn this into a perfect square trinomial. And so you're going to see why it makes it a perfect square trinomial in a little bit. All right, so to find the value of c, what you're going to do is take half the b term. So again, the b term is the number in front of the x. You're going to take half of it, and then you're going to square that number. Okay, so it's b divided by 2 all squared. Once we do that, we find that c value, we'll have a perfect square trinomial, and then we can factor it. All right, so let's do question A, x squared plus 10x plus c. So the first thing we want to do is find out what is this c value going to be to turn it into a perfect square trinomial. And so we're going to use this formula right here, b over 2 squared. All right, so b is 10. We're going to divide it by 2, and then we're going to square that number. 10 over 2 is 5, 5 squared is 25. Okay, so that's what c is. All right, so we're going to just replace that c value with 25. So x squared plus 10x plus 25. Okay, now we're going to factor this. So when we factor this, this is a special trinomial that we just turned this into, and it's going to factor into a binomial squared. Okay, again, if we want to see it written out using the x method, because it's a trinomial, 25 would be on top, 10 on the bottom. We need 2 numbers that multiply to 25 but add to 10, so that would be 5 and 5. Right? So that means that this factors into x plus 5, x plus 5. And then we can rewrite that, because it's the same, as x plus 5 squared. So we want to write it as a binomial squared. And so this 5 actually is coming from half of the b term. Half of 10 is 5. All right, so let's do question B, x squared minus 8x plus c. So let's find that c value that would make this a perfect square trinomial. So again, we're going to take half the b term, which is negative 8, and then we're going to square that. So negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and negative 4 squared is positive 16. So that c value is always going to be a positive number, because as soon as you square it, whether it's positive or negative inside the parentheses, it's always going to turn positive. All right, so now we can write this as x squared minus 8x plus 16. So 16 completes the square, and now we're going to factor. Okay, again, if you wanted to use the x method, okay, if you feel safe doing that, 16 will be on top, negative 8 goes on the bottom. Two numbers that multiply to 16 but add to negative 8, it's going to be negative 4 and negative 4. All right, so again, this would factor into x minus 4 times x minus 4, or x minus 4 squared. All right, so that's the basics behind using completing the square. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and solve an equation using this method. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is move the old c term over to the other side, to the right side, if it's not already done for you. All right, so remember the c term is just the number without a variable. All right, and then we're going to complete the square by putting a new c term in its place, and to do that we take half the b term and square it. We're going to add that number to both sides. Then we're going to factor the left side into a binomial squared. The right side will simplify if we can, and then we'll square root both sides. So then once you've turned it into a binomial squared on step 3, the rest is using the square root method to solve. All right, so let's go ahead and do each of these questions. So number 1, x squared minus 4x equals 6. So they've already moved the c term to the right side for you. So now what we're going to do is complete the square. So when you do this, you're going to write x squared minus 4x, and what you're going to do is put a little space here. This is where the new c term is going to go to complete the square. Then equals 6, and then you're going to put another space after it, because whatever we add to the left side, you have to add to the right side, and that's what this says. Add it to both sides. All right, so this is where we find the c value. So we're going to take half of the c value and square it. All right, so, or half the b term and square it. So b is negative 4, and then we'll square it. So negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. Negative 2 squared is positive 4. So that 4 gets added to both sides. All right, so that's step 2. We've completed the square, and we've added it to both sides. So step 3 says factor the left side into a binomial squared. All right, so again, this is a trinomial, and if you wanted to use the x method, you could, but it's going to factor into a binomial squared. So again, if you need to use the x method, 4 would be on top, and negative 4 is on the bottom. Two numbers that multiply to positive 4 but add to negative 4 is negative 2 and negative 2. So this factors into x minus 2, or x minus 2 squared. Equals 6 plus 4 is 10. All right, so that's step 3. Now step 4, it says solve by taking the square root of both sides. So the rest of this is just using the steps from the previous method, the square root method. So square root both sides. We get x minus 2 equals plus or minus, equals plus or minus root 10. We can add 2. So x equals 2 plus or minus root 10. Now root 10 doesn't simplify, and we can't combine those numbers together, so that's as far as you can go. All right, number 2. X squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0. So 8 is the old c term. So we're going to move that to the other side, and so that means we have to subtract it to bring it over. So x squared plus 6x, we're going to leave a space, okay, to complete the square, equals 0 minus 8 is negative 8, and then we're going to leave another space. All right, so now we'll complete the square. So we're going to take half of the b term, which is 6. So we'll take half of 6 and square it. So 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. So we're going to add 9 to both sides. Now we're going to factor the left side. Again, it's going to factor into a binomial squared. So we need two numbers that multiply to 9 but add to 6. So that's 3 and 3. So that's going to factor into x plus 3, or x plus 3 squared, equals negative 8 plus 9 is 1. Now we'll square root both sides. Left side just becomes x plus 3. The right side, don't forget to put plus or minus, to square root of 1. Now, square root of 1 will simplify. It's 1. All right, and then I'm going to also subtract 3 over. So I have x equals negative 3 plus or minus, and then square root of 1 is 1. Now, because there's no radicals in this problem, I can actually add and subtract 1 from negative 3. All right, so I have x equals negative 3 plus 1, which is negative 2. And then I have x equals negative 3 minus 1. Negative 3 minus 1, which is negative 4. Okay, so the two solutions are negative 2 and negative 4. All right, and then question 3. Again, we have the old c value in there, which is positive 40, so we're going to subtract that 40 over to the right side. X squared minus 12x, leave a space, equals negative 40, leave a space. All right, so let's take half the b term, which is negative 12, cut it in half, and then square it. So negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6. Negative 6 squared is positive 36. So we're going to add 36 to both sides. Now we're going to factor the left side. So again, the left side will always factor into a binomial squared. So we need two numbers that multiply to 36 but add to negative 12. So it's negative 6 and negative 6. Or, if you, again, recognize it, it's just half of that b term. So negative 12 divided by 2 is negative 6. So it's going to be x minus 6 squared, equals negative 40 plus 36 is negative 4. Okay, we'll square root both sides. So we get x minus 6 equals plus or minus. We're going to pull that negative out and then simplify the square root of 4. So that's going to be 2i. I'll add 6 to both sides. So we get x equals 6 plus or minus 2i. All right, so because there's an I in this problem, just like with the radical on number 1, you can't combine these together. So you can't do 6 plus 2 and 6 minus 2. All right, so that's as far as you can go, because those are unlike terms, so you can't combine them. All right, and then the last 3 problems, I just want to review simplifying fractions. All right, so on A, 4 plus or minus 8 over 6. Since there's no radicals or i's in this problem, we're going to actually do 4 plus 8, and then divide that answer by 6, and then do 4 minus 8, and then divide that answer by 6. Okay, so we're splitting this up into 2 problems that we can simplify. So 4 plus 8 is 12 over 6, which is 2. Okay, and then 4 minus 8 is negative 4 over 6, and then that can simplify to negative 2/3. Right, so we get these 2 different answers when you don't have any radicals or i's in the problem. You actually have to add and subtract the 2 numbers on top and then divide by 6. All right, now question B, we do have a radical. We would want to try to simplify the radical if we could. Root 5 doesn't simplify. All right, but just like with the imaginary numbers, anytime you have 3 numbers out here, if you can divide all 3 by the same number, you have to divide them. So we can divide them all by 2. All right, so we're going to divide all those numbers by 2. So 6 divided by 2 is going to be 3, plus or minus. 2 divided by 2 is 1, and then radical 5. So there's really a 1 in front. You don't have to put it. If you want to put it, you can. And then that's all divided by 2 divided by 2 is 1. All right, so again, this would just look a little cleaner if you rewrite it like this. 3 plus or minus root 5. Right, and then C, we have that radical, so we want to try to simplify it. And we do have the negative underneath the radical, so we are going to pull the negative out. So we'll have negative 9 plus or minus. Now the negative comes out and we get an I, root 9, and then root 9 is 3. So we have 3I all over 3. Right, so just like the previous question, when we have 3 numbers out here, if we can divide them all by the same number, we want to divide them. So we're going to divide by 3. So negative 9 divided by 3 is negative 3, plus or minus. 3I divided by 3, it's just I, all over. 3 divided by 3 is 1. And so we can clean this up a little bit. Looks a little nicer, like this. Negative 3 plus or minus I. All right, again, if you have 3 numbers on the outside of a radical or I, look for a number that you can divide them all by, and it's just so you can simplify the fraction. Okay, that's it.